Hello everybody and welcome to this workshop with the wonderful Vikki and Paula from the PDA Society, who have agreed to have a chat with us this evening and answer some questions from our families that have been pre-submitted, and also talk to us a little bit about PDA and why the PDA Society began. So welcome ladies, and thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you very much for having us.
So yeah, do you want to start then with the beginning on why the PDA Society was formed and your history around that?
So I've been involved with the PDA Society since 2004, when I first found out that my son may have the PDA profile of autism. And we were literally a group of parents with a one-page website and a lovely forum, but there were so few of us that realised that PDA existed, that it was a profile of autism, that you could post on the forum and not get a reply for over a week. There were just, not many parents at all. So from those days, back in 2014, when we were called the PDA contact group, a few of us sort of in the middle of England actually began to get together for coffee, probably only once every 3 months. And I actually had a coffee with Margot Duncan, who was what was her title? Oh, I've forgotten now.
Well, she was a GP, wasn't she? And then, yeah. But she was, instrumental in setting up the PDA Society, wasn't she?
That's right, yeah. So she sort of took over the running of the PDA contact group. And as we began to meet for coffee more regularly, and there was just a small group of mums, so let's say 6 mums around a kitchen table, deciding what we could do to raise awareness of PDA, to not only help our children, but to help many children around the country. So we decided, just as the National Autistic Society did many years ago, probably back in the 50s, we decided that, we did need charity status. We did need to get information out to professionals regarding the PDA profile of autism. And so we took a grant to produce the first booklet, which was called the Practitioner's Booklet. And we distributed that booklet out to thousands of psychologists, CAMs, etc. And that was one of the first things we began doing. We also then set up the charity in about 2016. Just before that, we did decide that no one was actually teaching parents how to parent their children with PDA. Because we all know you do need different strategies for children with autism, and you do need different strategies as a parent for children with PDA. And so we decided to develop a parenting course, and it was a 6-week parenting course, and the first 2 were in Nottinghamshire, and they were full. And in fact, I think we could have filled them 10 times over, because parents were so eager to learn. So that's how we started the training courses. We then went on to run our first conference in Northamptonshire in 2015. Since then, obviously the chair has changed a few times, and we've always had a nice core of trustees, probably about 6 trustees, who have all worked together really hard. And we have a team of training facilitators. We have an inquiry line team who answer our inquiries. We have admins on the forum. What else have I missed, Vikki?
Well, I think really our reach and sort of remit has grown quite considerably, hasn't it, really, even over the last few years, and, you know, providing a full suite of information, support and training to individuals, families and professionals, and broadened out from our original focus being parents, and focused towards parents supporting their children, to broadening that out to supporting and providing information for adult PDAs as well, and particularly having more of a focus on professionals. And certainly that's our focus this year, because we're finding increasingly that adult PDAs are beginning to understand themselves, families understand their child with PDA, but it's actually the system and the professionals who probably need to sort of catch up in terms of getting up to speed with what PDA is and how best to help.
Yeah, so even though we did start out, you know, as a group of mums trying to help other parents, yes, we have vastly grown since then, but all in quite a very short space of time. So, you know, we are talking literally 5 years that all those services and all that understanding and, you know, our support to others has grown. And it's not just national now, it is very much international, as we try to help, you know, sort of individuals and parents in other countries via our inquiry line. Although I should really keep that silent, but never mind.
Well, that's because we're officially a charity in England and Wales.
Yes.
But you know, certainly the very first webinar we did a couple of years ago, there were you know, 1,500 people from around the world who registered for access to that, and we were quite blown away. And we're regularly contacted, again, not just by parents and individuals, but by professionals around the world looking for input and support and advice. So yeah, we don't sort of trumpet that too much, because officially, as I said, we're a charity in England and Wales, but absolutely there is worldwide interest.
Yeah, I think that's really noticeable, especially, so I don't know if it's a sort of the last 18 months to 2 years, I've seen a huge increase in questions around PDA. And are you going to say something there, Meg? Sorry.
I think just how amazing it is, really. You know, when you're talking 5 years, it's not a long time really, and to have achieved all of that in that period of time is amazing. To be the go-to, and for families, just, you know, even word of mouth, everybody knows about you and can trust that they're going to somebody, you know, somebody that knows what they're talking about, that will give them the right advice. But I just, yeah, people sometimes talk to us about sort of our organisation and how quickly it's grown. And I think even more so really with you guys as well. I think that's amazing, just to say that really, and that I hope you're proud of yourselves, really.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think we're all very passionate. And the other thing to say is we're volunteers. You know, the PDA Society is volunteer led and has been predominantly volunteer run throughout its entire 5 years. Only just very recently have we taken on a bit of paid admin support. And I think that's where it comes from, really. It's that passion and drive and about it that can make things happen.
And why did you get involved in the PDA Society, Vikki? What was your background?
So I had a quote unquote unique child who nobody could quite understand or get to the bottom of, or didn't tick the right boxes for the right diagnosis. And then eventually a Senko at a school that he was at said, "Have you looked at PDA?" And I did what everybody else does and went to the PDA Society website and went tick, 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 and had that light bulb moment, and finally something made sense. And I think it was really when I read the strategies, the helpful approaches section, and I discovered that actually that's what I'd kind of worked out through trial and error, but kind of kept beating myself up. I wasn't, doing traditional parenting or, what have you. And I think it was really that made me think that, I've found the right place, and I attended the first PDA Society conference. And just to be in a room with 200 other people who totally got it. And when I sort of related anecdotal stories of what happened in our home, instead of people saying, "You did what?" and "He did what?" it was like, "Yes," and, giving their own examples. So, and And then it went from there. So I started helping Paula with the inquiry line, and then got involved more broadly than that. So my background is a sort of business background, marketing background. So I'm the comms lead, although we all wear lots and lots of different hats. So yeah, and then grown with the charity as it's grown.
Wonderful. Well, I think that brings us nicely on to the questions, because I know I've got lots of questions, but I think a lot of them will be covered off in these brilliantly submitted questions for our family. So I think if we start with, we have one here, which is, why won't our local authority accept PDA, and what is the reason?
Okay, I'll give it a go to begin with, and then if I've missed anything, Vikki will probably, sort of add some extra bits. So there is usually a couple of main reasons why local authorities, i.e. education, health and social care, won't accept that PDA exists, and why they won't recognise it as an actual condition on the autistic spectrum. The first reason is usually to do with health professionals who, I suppose they've got their manuals, their directories of all their diseases and disorders, and they're usually called the DSM and the ICD. They're the two main manuals. And most professionals look to those manuals to say, well, does the child fit this particular disorder or that particular disease? And they look at the criteria. Now, as we know at this current time, the PDA profile of autism isn't actually directly mentioned in either of those manuals. So many professionals won't allow any flexibility in diagnosis. And so professionals will look in the manuals and say, well, there's ASD, and that's all there is. And if the child fits the criteria, meets the criteria for ASD, then I'll give an ASD diagnosis. If they don't fit that criteria, then I can't give an ASD diagnosis. So unfortunately, within our NHS at the current time, some health professionals just won't be flexible around diagnosis. Also, many of them have either heard of PDA, and because it's not in the manuals, just won't even talk about it to parents, or they've not actually had any training in how to diagnose PDA. So many of them won't even talk to parents about PDA because they don't know anything about PDA. The parent may know more than the professional, and that doesn't make them feel good, I'm sure. So that's another reason why professionals in the health sector, won't talk about PDA, won't diagnose PDA. They may not actually be trained in how to diagnose it, on what to look for. But I think what we need to say to parents is, try to go to the NHS first if you possibly can. Try to see a paediatrician or go to a development centre. If it's your CAMs that do diagnoses of ASD, then yes, go to them. But go armed. When we say go armed to parents or to individuals, adults, what we mean is make sure that you've printed out some information on PDA. Make sure that you write down the way in which you meet the criteria for PDA and take it with you so that you can hand it to the professional so that they can mull over it and understand that you may not have ASD, but you may have demand avoidance with your ASD. And therefore, some NHS professionals will give a diagnosis of ASD with demand avoidance. It's not perfect, but it would be acceptable, and then education, placement, schools will then, you know, probably understand more about the child themselves.
And how often are those manuals updated? Is it something that's updated over, you know, every few 5 to 10 years? Is that the reason why it's not been included, or have you had conversations with the inclusion of PDA in those manuals with anybody at higher levels?
I'll let Vikki comment in a second, but I'm not actually quite sure how often they are actually updated, but I know we've had an update quite recently. But I think what I would say to parents is, and individuals, would be, we don't know whether PDA as a term is going to enter the DSM or the ICD, because I had a son in the 1990s that was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Now, there aren't any children now that are diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome because it has been taken out of the DSM, and children usually get an ASD diagnosis. Well, that's fine for some. It's even possibly fine for those that would not ordinarily classify themselves as having Asperger's syndrome. But it's not fine for those that have a demand avoidant profile, PDA, because the strategies are different, the helpful approaches are different between a child that has ASD and a child that has the PDA profile of ASD. So that's why it's important, but whether we're going to see it in the DSM anytime soon, we don't know. Vikki, have you got anything to add to all of what I've been saying?
Yeah, I think the manuals are very much based on research. So for a condition to enter a manual, vast quantities of research has to be done, and there simply hasn't been enough research on PDA to date. So whereas autism was first identified, let's say, in the 1940s, and we are where we are today, but we're still learning an awful lot about the complexity and dimensionality of the autism spectrum now. So PDA was only sort of potentially identified as a profile in the 1980s. So it's a much younger sort of diagnosis, if you like. So there's that factor, and there simply hasn't been enough research done into PDA, which is why we always say PDA is best understood as a profile on the autism spectrum, because nobody can absolutely say for sure at the moment that that's absolutely our understanding. So that's one aspect of it. And then in the recent editions of these manuals, as Paula said, you know, Asperger's was taken out as a diagnosis. So my son was diagnosed in 2013, and he also has a diagnosis of Asperger's, but no longer is that a diagnosis, because it was replaced with an umbrella term called ASD, autism spectrum disorder. But the idea is that somebody has a broad autism diagnosis, and then an accompanying report identifies strengths and challenges and needs that accompanies that broad umbrella diagnosis. And it's there that demand avoidant traits should be identified. So demand avoidance is listed in the NICE guidelines as a sign and symptom of autism. So there's no reason why within NICE guidelines people cannot diagnose ASD with a demand avoidant profile or with demand avoidant traits, or often it's the terminology that people get hung up on, because, you know, parents and individuals go in and talk about PDA because obviously we're the PDA Society and it's called PDA, but, you know, sometimes clinicians' heckles rise at the mention of the word, but in fact, actually, if you talk about needs and if you talk about presentations and being demand avoidant and how to support that, then sometimes that can get around the problem a little bit. So sometimes it's about using other terminology other than just PDA. We've always said if we have to rename ourselves, you know, we're not wedded to the name PDA, then, you know, that's absolutely fine. It's about understanding people and supporting them in the right way.
And do you think that, you know, it's quite a recent thing for all of these different conditions to be under the umbrella term ASD or ASC, as some prefer to call it. Do you think that's helpful to give a wider opportunity to talk about a variance of different conditions, or do you think it's harmful for conditions such as PDA and even Asperger's, where you have, you know, completely different behaviours? And do you think it's potentially become more confusing for people because where people have, you know, a fixed opinion and view and understanding of what autism is, now to expand that to autism spectrum disorder or autism spectrum conditions, which will be plural under that umbrella, do you think that's helpful or harmful?
Well, I think there's the debate, isn't there, about whether you're a clumper or a lumper. Do you clump it all together, or do you lump it all together, or do you, anyway, whatever, I've confused myself. But I think, you know, the main thing is about understanding individuals. And I think, as you rightly say, for whatever reason, lots of people, including diagnosticians, have quite a fixed view as to what autism looks like. And with the neurodiversity movement and the increasing number of autistic advocates who are speaking about their experiences, I think that turns all of it on its head, really. And, you know, everybody talks about a spiky profile, particularly in Asperger's, that a child may well be, you know, very, very capable in one area, have a lot of difficulties in another area. So you end up with this sort of spiky profile. Well, I think broadening that out, that dimensionality aspect of autism, you know, every autistic person is different and has their own strengths and challenges and needs and, you know, so on and so forth. So I don't quite know whether that answers your question. I don't know that it's harmful or helpful, really, but I think we actually need to shift away from, personally, I think we need to shift autism away from a very medical model and look at it. More broadly from a neurodiversity perspective.
Completely agree with that. I think, you know, it more focused on individuality and the needs of a person rather than, you know, if there's a diagnosis, it's, oh, well, this is how we deal with this person because of this diagnosis. Well, actually, no, you need to get to know that person, understand that person, and then figure out how you support that person, not based on the diagnosis. It's based on their individual. We're very much fans of the social model and something that we definitely practice and agree with. So another question here is, what is the difference between ODD, so oppositional defiance disorder, and PDA?
Ooh, I like this one. So I've done a little bit of work around attachment disorder, ODD, and PDA because I looked after a little boy for a long time who had quite severe attachment disorder. So I think in a nutshell, to begin with, ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, is more of a behavioural disorder. A condition that can last a few months, it can last a few years. An individual isn't born with oppositional defiance disorder. And they are defiant to all in authority, parents, teachers, police, etc. Whereas the PDA profile of autism, it's a lifelong autistic spectrum disorder. The individual is born with the disorder and it becomes more noticeable as they, you know, develop into a preschool, you know, child. It is a lifelong disorder, and individuals are demand avoidant. They're not defiant, they're demand avoidant. And they're demand avoidant in many situations, not all situations. And it doesn't mean to say that they're explosive in all situations of being placed, with demands being placed upon them. You know, some individuals will freeze under anxious situations. Some will explode fight, flight. We all know what happens when an individual becomes anxious and panics. So I think they're the main differences between these two particular disorders. Does that explain, do you think, the question?
Yes, and obviously there's a lot of anxiety associated to PDA as well, isn't there? And would you say that's one of the main differences in, obviously, other than the fact of the lifetime and the short span of ODD or development of ODD over time, the anxiety-based avoidance with PDA? So ODD is not anxiety based, whereas PDA is. Would you say that's a big difference as well?
I would say it is a difference. I'm not saying children with ODD don't have anxiety. It depends who they're facing with their defiance, if you like, and their being oppositional. But I would say anxiety is one of the main features of a person with PDA, because PDA is best understood as an anxiety-driven need to control and avoid the everyday demands of life.
And this is not something that a parent or carer would start to notice at the age of 14, 15. It's something they will have noticed from very early.
Yeah, I mean, we usually, yes, definitely. They will have noticed some type of issues with anxiety and demand avoidance, possibly, their controlling behaviour, probably before the age of 5. But many parents say that they didn't realise to what extent their child had those difficulties. And probably until either they went to school, or even sometimes until they went to secondary school, because they treated the child with kid gloves and handled, as much of the behaviour as they could. But it's then the outside demands that become too much for the child.
Probably putting strategies in the home that they don't even realise that they're doing, because they've lived and understood it for so long.
Yeah. I think Vikki was one of those cases, if you like. She was actually doing a lot of the things that her son needed without knowing that her child had got PDA. Yeah. So that does happen, but sometimes there's a bit more of a rapid onset of the demand avoidance and the anxiety if the child enters, a different environment. Now, whether that's could be even going on holiday sometimes, but entering a new school maybe.
Wondering for somebody who
sorry, Meg, go on. No, go on.
I was wondering if for somebody who doesn't have much experience at all with PDA, if you could give us some examples of what demand avoidance looks like as opposed to defiance, the example you were given before. Just to sort of illustrate the point, I think would be helpful.
I think that's exactly what I was going to say. I think also one of the key things in PDA is the way demands are avoided. So I don't know enough about ODD, Paula can perhaps clarify, but with PDA, it is not often, initially anyway, a case of withdrawing, refusing, shutting down, running away. Normally that's as panic sets in and anxiety rises. So when anxiety is lower, or the demands are lower, or the ability to cope is lower, the first thing you'll see is much more likely to be sort of so-called social avoidance strategies. So that might be something like distraction. Oh, those are nice socks. Or it might be, oh, well, I'll do it, but I'll do it tomorrow, or I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it later. Or, well, I'd love to help, but my legs don't work. Or I don't know what a saucepan is. Or so those, or role playing, or saying, well, I would come to the table, but I'm a cat, and they don't eat at the table. So it's those sort of, and then we've got on our website a sort of a pyramid shape, and those are the lower level, if you like, demand avoidance approaches. And then as things get more stressful, or as more pressure is put on, or as anxiety rises, then that escalation can be very rapid, you know, especially if pressure's being put on externally. So then different, as Paula was saying, anxiety, threat responses, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, kicks in. And it's only at that stage when panic is increasing that you might get to the point of meltdown. So I think what's really important from all of that is for everybody around the individual with PDA and the individual themselves is to recognize the lower level, you know, demand avoidance strategies that are going on that you might dismiss initially if you're not aware that that might be a thing, and to try and address things at that stage before things escalate. I think the other thing to think about is what is in fact a demand, because demands are, you know, many and varied and, you know, all pervasive. So one of the defining features of PDA, as Paula said, is a demand avoidance of everyday demands. So that's the first thing, is we're not talking about big demands necessarily, we're talking about everyday demands: washing, dressing, eating, getting up, and demands that are internal as well as demands that are imposed from other people. So whether that's hopes, expectations, thoughts, desires, wishes, even things like going to the toilet or feeling hungry, those are all internal demands. There's indirect demands: praise, expectation, time, uncertainty. Once you begin to sort of understand life in terms of demands, you see that they are in fact everywhere. So I think there's that dual aspect to it. It's so demand avoidance is the need to avoid demands, and it's a question of can't, not won't. It's not oppositional, it's not defiance, it's a can't situation, not a won't situation. But it's also the ways you go about avoiding demands, so it encompasses those two aspects. Paula, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, just to say, to sum it up then, Meg, you know, it is literally, when we talk about demand avoidance, it isn't just demands, you know, that a teacher places on a child or an employer places on an individual. It is any type of request, any type of expectation that a parent may have on a child. So it isn't just demands. And I think parents who sometimes get in touch with us through our inquiry line, you know, they often say to us, but I'm not really demanding they do anything. And I say, well, would you like them to sit at the table and eat their dinner? Oh yes, I always insist they sit at the table. Well, it's a demand. You know, you're expecting that they sit at the table. So yeah, Vicki's right.
And then, so that would come on to another good question, which is, what strategies do you recommend to avoid explosive reactions?
I think I'll start off by just saying that when you realise your child has a disorder like PDA, you've then got to learn a whole new way of parenting. You know, it's not as simple as, come on, everybody to the door, we're all going to school, come on, get your shoes on, get your coat on, off we go, let's have a lovely time today. It's just not that anymore. It's more, oh, where's my shoes? Oh, it's a Monday, isn't it? And it's so difficult for a parent that's been used to parenting a traditional way to suddenly stop doing that and start doing a very indirect parenting way that is going to be able to keep their child's anxiety low. So we have a massive section on our website called Helpful Approaches, explaining the different ways in which parents can parent their children. Or on our adults section, you know, we have lots of coping strategies to help them cope with the demands. And so what I suppose I want to say, rather than splitting it into this strategy, that helpful response, is it is a completely different new way of parenting in the way that you act, in the way that you communicate, you know, the things that you say, the things that you do with your child. And it is very difficult to learn, and it can take parents many months, many years in some cases. And sometimes a diagnosis really helps to confirm to the parent that they do need to start using the PDA helpful approaches to parent their child. Because before diagnosis, sometimes they flounder between traditional parenting and the PDA helpful approaches, which, you know, sends them and the child into a little bit of chaos. So I haven't actually mentioned many things, Vikki. Do you want to just mention a few things that we advocate for people to do?
Yeah, I think, you know, as you've said, it's a sort of holistic rewiring, really, isn't it, of family life or your individual life as an adult. And, you know, it's also, as we were saying, about intervening earlier, recognizing earlier before we get to the stage of things being very explosive, because once you've got to the stage of things being very explosive, it's too late. And it's a question of riding the storm out and picking up the pieces afterwards. Sometimes it can be as simple as phraseology. So rather than, you know, it's time to go to bed, it could be, your pajamas are on, or the pajamas, so not you, so the pajamas are on the bed. Would you like milk or, you know, Horlicks tonight? So it's more indirect, but it's also using different phraseology. It's not saying you need to go to bed now or it's time for bed. It's introducing that demand. And it's also not about having no demands at all. I think sometimes that's something that gets a bit lost in translation. We're not advocating for no demands at all, because that's not realistic. It's about, you know, matching somebody's capacity to cope with demands with the demands you're putting into the system. And some days that may be very low or almost zero, and some days it may be quite a lot higher. And it's about sort of having that balance. In one of the books about PDA, the first book, Understanding, I can't even remember what it's called, by Ruth Fiedler and Phil Christie and Margot Duncan, they have this concept of two dials, like those old-fashioned radio transistor dials, and it's about matching the input demand that you're giving to the capacity demand on the other dial on the other side. So I think that's quite a factor. And as Paula said, there's huge amounts of information on our website, lots of case studies as well, so that people can read about it in context. And we sort of summarise this. We adopted the giant panda as our ambassador, because everybody understands that pandas also need very specific accommodations in order to thrive. And we have a useful infographic which sort of summarises helpful approaches for PDA using I can never pronounce this word, but the word, what's it called when you have a letter to remember something? Mnemonic. Using the PANDA mnemonic. So P is for pick your battles, and A is for anxiety management, and N is for negotiation. And I can't remember now what DNA are, but they're, you know, that's all on our website. But it's quite a handy way, a sort of ready reckoner of, you know, how best to help.
I was going to ask a question about professionals, if that's okay. So one of the questions we've been asked is, what work can I do with school and other professionals like my social worker to help them understand PDA and manage demands when school's set up, obviously with constant demands? So first off, we'll obviously be telling everybody to have a look at your website, because there is, like you said, a wealth of information on there and some really good examples as well. But particularly for professionals, what would your advice be for parents in sort of how to upskill professionals?
I think one of the first things we would say is, if you're going into a meeting and you recently, you know, began to understand that your child may have PDA, or, you know, your child's just been given a diagnosis, you know, we would say, why not print out some information from the PDA Society website or the National Autistic Society website? They also have some information on PDA. Why not print off, for schools, I would say there's a booklet on our website I think we call it the Positive PDA book, but I can't remember its full title. And it is full of simple strategies for schools. And I think that is a very, very good book to first hand to a teacher or a Senko at school. It tackles, how to communicate with the child slightly differently in a very indirect way. So I'd go into the meeting with some information for the teacher and a short, very precise document that the parent may have written on what the child's difficulties are within school due to their, PDA. So that's one of the things I would do with schools. I mean, if schools aren't understanding and they're not, sort of managing to lower their demands on the child, then I would obviously think about maybe asking for the educational psychologist to come into school, or maybe the autism team to come into school. And if things really aren't working out for the child and the school aren't, putting in some reasonable adjustments and support for the child, then I would say, and I always do say this, parents apply for the EHC plan. Parents. Don't wait for the schools to do it. Parents do it, because if a parent does it, they can appeal the local authority's decision. A school can't do that. Okay, so that's one of the things I would do for schools. For social workers would be something quite similar, really. Print off our What is PDA booklet, because most social workers, whilst they're qualified social workers, they don't have standard autism training and definitely don't have PDA training unless they've sought it out for themselves. So I suppose I would say, print out our What is PDA booklet and do another document about your child and the difficulties they have and the way to manage, or the way the parent is managing the child's behaviours. Okay, so there are a couple of things I would do. Anything to add to that, Vikki?
I think that was pretty comprehensive. I think have confidence as a parent. I think sharing the strategies that work at home, giving scenarios and saying, this is what I used to do and this is what resulted and now I try this. Trying as much as you can to empathise with teachers, especially because, they're under lots of pressure, and sort of present it as your I think, sorry, did I just disappear momentarily? Oh, yeah. I live in the middle of nowhere, so my internet connection is a bit rubbish. So I think, yeah, definitely have confidence, show your own examples, try and empathise if you can with the professional so that you're not getting into a battle. It's much easier said than done, I know. Training, luckily I was asked, it was before I was involved with the PDA Society, but the school my son was at said, you seem to have a really good understanding, would you mind doing a twilight session for our teachers? So, feel confident in sharing that information. If you're not somebody who could stand up or sit down or do a presentation, then we and other organisations run twilight training sessions for professionals as well, going from an hour's introductory course to a kind of more of a 4-hour half-day inset type thing. And then as the PDA Society, we are having a big focus on professionals this year, and one of the things we're trying to do is share best practice. So get professionals to talk to professionals and share best practice, because there are some great people out there doing great things, and we need to share that and show what a difference that could make.
We're smiling because that's exactly our ethos, and very much working together, and also just around what you were saying earlier. About but yeah, one of the things that we're campaigning for is an increase in education around SEND, specifically for social workers and teachers, because there is no education at a degree level, and we say they're being taught to teach in a world that no longer exists. Social workers are newly qualified, going out into a world of high need, having not learned anything about it at all. So the importance of increasing that awareness, and we're doing some work at the moment, you know, at parliamentary level, trying to increase that learning around SEND and social, emotional and mental health needs as well for teachers and social workers, because, you know, they're set up to fail in a way, really.
I was a social worker for over a decade, and I didn't ever attend any specific training. The obvious equality and diversity type tick box training, but other than that, it was down to sort of individual learning or individual families that had come across to be able to sort of learn about particular conditions. Or it's just, you would expect that teachers and social workers and police particularly as well would have specific training, and it just doesn't happen. And I think people would be really surprised if they're aware of how little training that there was, really.
Yeah.
I think even, I don't know if this is absolutely true, but I've heard that adult psychiatrists have no autism element in their core training.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that's quite shocking.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Because I think ultimately in a lot of the degree courses where the replacements, actually it's very much dependent on that particular experience within that setting. But yeah, I think it's the same. And, you know, I think we're working with quite a lot of universities, and they're sort of recognising now that need for real life experience and a variety of experience, particularly for psychologies, because not just psychologist course, there are many, aren't there? But they're just recognising that. And I think right across the board, I think within every profession, every sort of team around the family, so to speak, there's just a lack of knowledge and awareness. And I think that's why we're smiling, because, you know, when you're talking, it's very similar to sort of what we say. And I think it's been a long time since we've been in a meeting like this, really, where it feels very much
nice,
on
to
the
be
same page.
amongst like-minded people,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, I think this is going to end up being a two-parter, because we could just talk and talk and talk. I think we'll maybe cover off one more question, but I just don't think we're going to get through them all, because what we don't want to do is, you know, have a video that's sort of hour and a half, 2 hours long, and sort of get lost in that really crucial information. So I think if we split it into a couple, it'll just be more helpful for people. So let's have a look at this is a really interesting one, actually, and I think maybe a good one to finish on, because I think some of the other questions are, you know, answers will be very lengthy and potentially lead on to other questions. So if we end with this one, so can PDA be written into an EHCP in an area that does not recognise it as a condition? So maybe on that, to sort of have a think about whether or not a parent could put it in their parental views, because obviously it wouldn't be under a diagnosis section, but maybe could it be included and have that, you know, the child has a PDA profile anywhere within an EHCP if it's not recognised in that area?
I think I'm a good example, really, of exactly that. So when my son's, well, he had a statement, because he's actually 26 now, and I took his statement was changed into an EHCP, and it ran all the way to 25. I was quite proud that he remained in education until he was 25, because he was extremely delayed in his development. So, so the question is, did he have a diagnosis of PDA when his statement, or EHCP, was written? And the answer to that was no, he didn't. But there were a few professionals that had written reports that had, and this was quite a while ago, we're talking, hold on, bear with me, 15 years ago or more, there were a few professionals that identified that what they classified as he wasn't a typical autistic child. He didn't behave like an autistic child in the classroom, and strategies known to work for children with autism did not work for him. So when it came to writing his statement in EHCP, the words autism with demand avoidance did appear, not just in my parental views, but also in his needs. So that's would be section B for Bertie now. And the strategies to manage his behaviour, his PDA behaviour, were actually put into section F for Freddie. So I am a bit of a classic example, if you like, of a parent that did manage to get all his needs around demand avoidance, controlling behaviour, his fantasy and role play, all those things were put into his plan, and they had corresponding strategies and support to meet his needs in section F. So it is possible, but you usually have to try and get it in there other than the words pathological demand avoidance. And some parents, you know, don't like to think they've got to water it down a tiny bit. But to get it in there and to get the strategies in there, sometimes we have to as parents at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think it was important that the strategies were right and the provision was right, the support was right, rather than the actual words PDA.
An interesting point, that, isn't it?
Really
That's
is. And yeah, I think it's really helpful actually to hear from yourselves that that fight doesn't always need to be fought, and that there are ways in order to achieve what you need to achieve for your child if you are clever about it. And it doesn't matter if the words aren't in there, as long as the helpful strategies and support and the unique needs of that child and individual is included within the document.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, we tend to think of a diagnosis as the holy grail, and that once we've got this diagnosis, suddenly everything will be different. But in fact, nothing is different. So when my son was diagnosed, actually also not with PDA at that stage, but with Asperger's, ADHD, sensory processing disorder and anxiety disorder, bless him, I thought, okay, well now package B is going to come off the shelf at school because they know what they're dealing with. And then I very rapidly found out that there was not only no package B, but in fact there was no shelf. But yeah, so it's absolutely about focusing on needs and about what helps. And if terminology is getting in the way, let's use different terminology.
Absolutely.
Just specifically about the EHCP, we've got a really good new resource on our website, a really detailed guide to EHCPs and what sort of things to include. Obviously, every child is an individual, but you know, lots of thoughts as to what other people have included in EHCPs, and it's all structured by the different sections in the EHCP, so it's quite easy to work through as well.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's really handy. We'll definitely share that on our websites as well. I think that'd be really helpful. I think that would be a good time to bring it to a close, but I'd definitely love to invite you back to speak to us again, because I think there's so much more we can talk about, and I'm just mindful that this is also your evening, so we really appreciate the time. We don't want to take up any more time, but thank you so much, and we're really excited to be working with you going forwards.
Absolutely, thank you.
Just to add that, you know, if parents do want any more detailed support, having listened to this, then of course we have our inquiry line service, so they can get in touch. Or obviously, first port of call is the website, because it is, you know, quite comprehensive. But our inquiry line is there for any specific cases that people may want an answer around.
Wonderful. And can you just share your website for us, please?
Yes, it's www.pdasociety.org.uk.
Thank you very much.